Hello and welcome to this, the second of 4 video lectures about the human value of progress. It is called Capitalism Gets Going and answers the not so trivial question, what was the most important event in world history? Jonathan Haidt, who we met briefly in the previous lecture and will meet again in the video lectures on the human value of tolerance, describes himself as a bit of a lefty. Imagine his surprise after becoming Professor of Ethical Leadership at New York University's Stern School of Business on discovering what he calls the most important event in history, an event whose consequences he had hitherto been unaware of, an event whose importance was explained to him by some of his new colleagues at the business school. This event we can call breakthrough progress. And it happened around 1800 in Europe. To set the scene, we need to look at human progress, or social development as Ian Morris calls it, going back to the last ice age, over 10,000 years ago. Ian Morris developed a social development index. His index has 4 components, which are energy capture per person, organization, a proxy would be the size of the largest city, war-making capability, and information, the storage and transmission of information. Morris wrote a best-selling book titled Why the West Rules for Now and made a video about the book. You can see the reference for the video on the bottom left of the slide. They make for a fascinating read and very informative viewing. Note that Morris uses the phrase social development, whereas this video lecture series uses the word progress. They are the same thing. As described in the previous video lecture, the 2 luckiest regions geographically, that is the ones where farming and agricultural civilization got going first, were the Middle East and Europe in the west and China in the east. They didn't know much about each other before the 17th century, but we can view history as a race, slow at first, between the East and the West. Here is that race to progress captured by Morris with his Social Development Index. The West is the darker line, China the lighter line. As the Ice Age recedes, starting 16,000 years ago, that's 14,000 before the Common Era, 14,000 BCE, over at the far left of the graph, the West develops agriculture first in the Fertile Crescents and begins a slow, just discernible increase in social development. Progress, in other words. China, the second luckiest region, gets agriculture going around 9000 BCE and starts to progress. 7,000 years ago, that's 5,000 before the Common Era, we can see an increase in the rate of progress for the West. That's the first agricultural civilization, the Summer civilization in present-day Iraq. And a couple of thousand years later, with the arrival of agricultural civilization in China, China's social development speeds up. There's a blip in the West around 1200 BCE, a blip in the steady progress of the West, a slight downturn. At that time, ancient Egypt is the top Western agricultural civilization and is being attacked by a mysterious people of the sea. And Morris finds evidence of migration, state failure, famine, climate change, and maybe disease. Coincidentally, that's around the time of Moses. And in China, around 1050 BCE, there's migration and state failure. We can see that in the small kick downwards on the lighter line. There's a drop starting around 0 of the Common Era, the year 0, for both and west. We can see both west and east falling. The fall is steeper and lasts longer in the west. That's the time of the fall of the Roman Empire, which was not only due to external barbarian attack, but also inner degeneration. Maybe it's no coincidence that Jesus Christ is said to have been born in 0 CE. The pessimism of a declining Roman Empire being a good place to spread a religion of good news and hope. But as far as progress is concerned, China takes the lead for the next 1,000 years. But by far the biggest change occurs around 1800 CE, when the West shoots up, the East lagging significantly behind. This is when industry arose in Great Britain first, then the rest of the West. Look at the scale of the change that came in social development. It's important to note that the vertical axis is a log scale, so the change was even greater than it appears on this graph. The log scale allows us to see small changes, the small changes that occurred before 1800. If you don't use a log scale, the graph is a near horizontal line up to 1800, when it changes to a near vertical line. No wonder Haidt called it the most important event in world history. In terms of human progress, much, much more important than the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. To summarize, Morris shows that social development was a two-horse race for millennia. The West, which is the Middle East and Europe, got a head start on social development before China, the East, got going. Both regions share many similarities, including claims of cultural uniqueness. For the West, it's Greek philosophy. For the East, Confucius. Both came around 500 BCE, when the West was still ahead. Both West and East declined abruptly around 0 CE, both suffering from out-of-region barbarian attacks and, for the Romans, social disorder. China falls least and recovers first. The fall of the Roman Empire brings the Dark Ages to Europe. China takes the lead for 1,000 years, then something extraordinary happened in Europe around 1800. Breakthrough progress. Here's another view of the most important event in history. This graph is about poverty. The yellow line is a measure of poverty, the red line a measure of extreme poverty, and the blue line represents a change in the way poverty is measured. All three tell the same story. 40,000 or more years ago, when humans became conscious, everyone lived as hunter-gatherers. No exceptions. 100% of people living in extreme poverty. As we saw with Ian Morris's social development, once agriculture gets going, a few people escaped poverty. That's the elite in agricultural civilizations. Slow progress over millennia meant that by 1820, when this graph starts, around 85% of the world's population still lived in extreme poverty. In other words, after 40,000 or more years of consciousness, more than 10,000 years of farming, 7,000 years of the snail-paced progress of agricultural civilizations, only about 15% of humanity had managed to escape extreme poverty. Then, in the next 200 years, another 70% of the world's population escape extreme poverty. And that's as the human population increased 7-fold over those 2 centuries. So again, you can see why Professor Haidt calls what happened in Europe around 1800 the most important event in history. There are no tricks with these graphs. There is nothing hidden or exaggerated. This is what has happened to humanity over the past 200 years. All of us have benefited enormously from this. Just one statistic out of the many that can be used to describe the massive improvement in the human condition that has taken place over the last 2 centuries. Global average life expectancy has more than doubled in the last century. That's just one statistic. The first question you might reasonably ask is, why are we not taught this? We should know about this because care. We worry about care. We normal people think about other people and care for them, and an immense amount of suffering has been avoided. We think in terms of fairness, and here the poor benefited more than the rich. And liberty, our core human value. The capacity to act on one's own free will has exploded. Knowledge has exploded, wealth has exploded, health has exploded. The second question you might reasonably ask is, what caused breakthrough progress? Was it A, Marxist doctrine was established? B, the first virtue signals from social justice warriors were received? Or C, capitalism really got going? Perhaps you share in Professor Haidt's surprise at the answer, which is of course C. Thankfully, Marxism came later and social justice much later. Before then, humanity could benefit progressively from capitalism. If you don't like the answer because you don't like the word capitalism, then there are only 2 others that you might consider using. Industrialization, which says that industries developed on a wide scale, which is true and represents progress. Or rule of law, which was critically necessary, representing tolerance. Note that the rule of law was not fully developed until nearer the end of the 20th century with the anti-discrimination laws that brought full equality before the law. But even at that early stage in 1800, the rule of law was critical. We look at the development of the rule of law in the first video lecture on tolerance called Rule of Law. But those 2 alternatives, industrialization and the rule of law, don't describe the cause of the most important event in history, as well as the word capitalism. Capitalism is the right word because it incorporates both industrialization and the rule of law, plus the not so secret ingredient that we're going to look at on the next slide. The profit motive, which facilitates risk-taking. The word capitalism must be one of the most abused words in English, and no doubt in other languages too. It's not often that anyone explains what exactly capitalism means. So here is a quick look at the theory. Anyone that sets up an enterprise of some kind has to set up the means to sell, produce, and deliver their product or service. That usually means a set of costs that are mostly fixed. Costs such as salaries for employees, payment for the inputs that suppliers provide, rents to landlords, interest on bank loans, and of course taxes for the government. Those costs are mostly fixed and enforced by contract law. They are obligations you are obliged to pay, regardless of what you sell, what revenue you receive. In contrast, the revenue side of the equation is mostly variable. In free markets, customers are not normally obliged to buy your products, and there is competition. So prices and volumes are not fixed. Revenue is variable. What that means is that you need someone to cover the risk of a shortfall with their capital, the risk of a loss. The reward or incentive or legal obligation is that they get to keep these capitalists get to keep any surplus that we would call a profit. Joint stock companies allow pooling of capital risk. Capitalism facilitates risk-taking. The theory of capitalism is that simple. Someone, call them a capitalist if you will, or some group, a joint stock company, which is a group of capitalists, take the risk that revenue might be less than costs and cover that risk with their own capital. If the enterprise is unsuccessful, they lose their capital, their money. If the enterprise is successful, they get to keep the profit to reinvest or spend on fat cigars as they wish. The hope of profit is the motive for them to put their capital at risk. Whilst we're on the subject, we might as well discuss the third part to this simplified description of capitalism, which gets much more attention today than it did in the past: externalities. Here are 3 illustrations of what is meant by externalities. Amazon wants to open a new campus. Everyone knows that the local externalities would be high-income neighborhoods, which mean jobs in service industries to serve those high earners, and a larger tax take in the surrounding area and higher house prices. Those local service jobs, extra local taxes, and increased house prices are all externalities that Amazon will try and capture by negotiating tax breaks with the local government. Another one, Amazon wants to close a warehouse. Everyone knows that the local externalities would be reduced income neighborhoods, knock-on effects in service industries, a smaller local tax take, and deflationary pressure on house prices. Maybe even opioid abuse to deal with the personal mental issues that accompany job losses. Amazon is likely to be reluctant to add to their costs by trying to alleviate the externalities their business decision has caused. And a third example, pollution. Instead of treating wastewater and putting it back into the environment in the same state that it was taken out, it's cheaper to dump the wastewater untreated. Thus, the effect of the untreated wastewater on the environment is an externality. Also, and in some ways linked to the idea of externalities, there probably should be another box dealing with reputation and brand. If you have a good reputation or a trusted brand, you can usually charge more or you have more customers. And a reputable employer, all other things being equal, can attract the best talent. But the picture here is a simplification to describe capitalism, not a complete picture. For a complete picture, we would also probably need to explain the balance sheet, profit and loss statement, and the role of cash flow. The bottom line, capitalism facilitates risk-taking with the profit motive, which we need for progress. Let capitalism be a dirty word. What we want is human progress, as shown on the previous 2 graphs. That means risk-taking. Why so? Because the future is uncertain and most of us fear uncertainty and are risk averse. But staying as we are, taking no risks, is, by definition, not progress. So having the profit motive to incentivize humanity's risk takers is the magic of capitalism. The American Enterprise Institute calls capitalism a poverty killer, with a nice tagline, if you hate poverty, you should love capitalism. So, if we don't want to use the C word, perhaps poverty-killing mechanism will do it. Now, any social construct, which is what capitalism is because it's not a natural phenomenon, has problems. Acts of God or chance, the creation of monopolies, meaning that prices are not so variable, fraud, bankruptcy, even a financial system unintelligible to those who run it. Try Googling collateralized debt obligations or CDOs from the financial crisis of 2008. So, every market there has ever been was regulated in some way or other, even if that regulation was just the reputational risk involved in gentlemen's agreements. If you failed to fulfill your obligations, everyone got to hear about it. And most times, give or take the odd rogue, you didn't get to do much business after that. The regulation of our poverty-killing mechanism today is much more sophisticated, even if still imperfect. Joking aside, regulated capitalism makes sense. Even better, democratically regulated capitalism. Some of the notable consequences of capitalism. Most of us fear the risk of uncertain outcomes. So the facilitation of risk-taking is key to progress. There will be no progress if we don't change in some way, and any change from the status quo means uncertainty and risk. So, unless there is risk-taking, there will be no progress. Tolerance, codified as the rule of law, is key to the success of capitalism's facilitation of risk-taking. Tolerance is a precondition for capitalism. Freedom of enterprise requires the rule of law. More on this in the first video lecture on the human value of tolerance called Rule of Law. Chinese Communist Party officials, Russian oligarchs, Iranian mullahs, Saudi princes, Venezuelan Marxists all take wealth. Capitalists are obliged to create it. A society focused on making wealth rather than taking wealth is demonstrably better for most people. Capitalism is a poverty killer, which means more cars, which means more energy, which means nothing created by conscious beings, no social construct will ever be perfect. Capitalist success at killing poverty has externalities that require attention, like the hole in the ozone layer that was caused by industrial chemicals and fixed by replacement industrial chemicals. Air and water pollution need remedying at source. We in the West, the democratically regulated capitalist countries, and the rest of the world are currently grappling with the issue of carbon dioxide emissions. Capitalism's division of labour drives productivity, meaning we each become more and more competent in a more and more specialised role. Consequently, coordination becomes more and more complex. Two examples. 30,000 parts in each of the 70 million cars manufactured annually. Those numbers come from Toyota in 2016, one of the world's biggest automobile manufacturers. The whole global setup is very, very efficient, or lean as they call it. Those parts are firstly brought together as components, and then components are brought together as sub-assemblies, like the engine, and then the sub-assemblies come together on the final assembly line. And this is global. The internet was not invented to provide on-demand video games or virtual friends, but to facilitate the coordination between different specialists, initially in the science community. But now it's the backbone of globalization. Second example, in a major city, 10 million people can get the lunch of their choice every day. It was Matt Ridley who pondered the marvel of choice for lunch in London, and he said, were there a London lunch commissioner to organise it, they would fail badly. Individual decisions integrated by price signals work and work very well indeed. Capitalism is now a complex adaptive system that has gone global. The global economy is mostly capitalist and coordinated through trade, travel, and the internet. Adam Smith used the term invisible hand. Matt Ridley talks of a collective intelligence. More recently, we hear of a human cloud. All of these are ways of describing the consequence of our economies being complex, adaptive systems. And we cannot control all the rhythms and outcomes of those complex, adaptive systems. Depression. That was the name of what happened in the 1930s as the capitalist countries fought mass unemployment, falling prices. It was all grouped together as depression. There was something else, rising inflation and rising unemployment at the same time in the 1970s, called stagflation. And then we had a financial crisis in 2008, which we haven't really been able to find another word for other than financial crisis. The point is, things go wrong. We tend to work out what went wrong and what to do about it after the event. We can't always predict, let alone control, what exactly the outcomes will be for complex adaptive systems like a capitalist economy. Building welfare safety nets to cushion against economic downturns is not anti-capitalist, it's pro-insurance. We get plastic on pristine beaches and in marine animals' stomachs. Being against single-use plastic, straws, bags, etc., is not anti-capitalist, it's pro-turtle. There's inequality, which has been decreasing globally in the last few decades, but increasing in the West. Being concerned about inequality is not anti-capitalist, it's pro-poverty killing in wanting the system to work for everyone, so we'll all want to keep it. Capitalism is often called immoral. How is that? It is without morals because it is not conscious. Humans are conscious, and it is we who must provide the consciousness. Again, capitalism needs human regulation. A complex adaptive system is amoral. It is we who need to provide the moral guidance. Thank you for watching. The next in the series, Understanding Ourselves Through Our Human Values, is the third of 4 video lectures about the human value of progress. It is called Cultural Good Fortune and explores the question, why did breakthrough progress happen in the West? It can be found at www.conservatus.com, where there's reasoning that resonates. Conservatus. Keep safe, intact, save from danger our human values.